Welcome back to Physical Anthropology. Today we're looking at Chapter 6, Primate Ecology and Behavior. Our topics for today include going over what is a primatologist and looking at some primate studies completed in the wild versus in the lab. We'll discuss why primates live in groups and what affiliative behaviors versus aggressive behaviors mean. And then we'll look at some specific examples of behaviors across primates, including their communication methods, food-seeking behaviors, social groups, and reproductive behaviors. So what is primatology? It's a subfield of biological anthropology where we're specifically looking at our living primate relatives, and we're looking at things such as how did their behaviors evolve, how intelligent are they, what are their social structures like, and we can use this to help explain some of our own behaviors as humans and to try to explain why different behaviors in humans have evolved. So a couple of primate studies in the wild, there are of course many more than this, but some of the leaders in the beginning of primatology were Jane Goodall, who studied extensively chimpanzees in the wilds of Tanzania, Diane Fossey, who studied the mountain gorillas in Africa, and Baruti Galdikas, who studied the orangutans. So these are, of course, our closest ape relatives, and learning about their behaviors really gave a lot of insights to modern human behaviors as well. They also promoted the conservation of these species because unfortunately, all of the great apes are endangered, especially due to habitat destruction by humans, as well as poaching and the murder of these animals, because sometimes people are trying to steal the babies and put them in private zoos, and sometimes they're killing the apes for food or for purchase of different items that people in that area want to get on the black market. So what about primate studies in the lab? There's definitely a lot of interest in how intelligent apes are and whether they are able to communicate with us using language. So again, this is not an extensive list, but there were some really interesting intelligence studies looking at problem solving in chimps. For example, setting up different scenarios where it was difficult to get a banana and trying to see how the chimpanzee would be able to obtain it. And we saw things that are very similar to human behavior, such as trial and error and having insights and coming up with different tools to help obtain that goal. We've also studied the idea of the theory of mind, which is, are these primates self-aware? Can they recognize self? Can they empathize with others? Can they figure out the emotions of others, and so forth? And to me, one of the most interesting things are the language studies. So back in the early 1960s, when they first attempted to teach apes to speak, those experiments completely failed, and that's due to the anatomy and the differences in the mouth structure, the tongue, and the larynx of apes versus humans. So humans are able to make a lot of different sounds that apes simply cannot do, and so it's impossible for them to learn spoken speech. However, new attempts at teaching them language focused on sign language because the hands of these apes are quite dexterous, like modern humans. And so they're able to form the different shapes of sign language. These have been much more successful, and they have taught sign language to gorillas, to chimpanzees, to bonobos, and orangutans. So across the different ape species, they have been able to do that. One of the really interesting stories is that of Coco the gorilla, who learned hundreds and hundreds of vocabulary words using sign language. An alternative way of looking at language is something called a lexigram. So in the picture on the bottom right, these bonobos, what they're doing is they're looking at, actually I think this picture might be of chimpanzees, but the bonobo kanzi is famous for starting this study. Basically, the lexigrams are different abstract symbols that represent something. So think of how the written language across human species, regardless of what language you speak or what script you use to write, it's very abstract because a certain symbol means something in the physical world. So they taught these apes to use the lexigrams to communicate and to obtain different goals. In the broader picture, what we have found is that apes definitely show intelligence, but there is a limitation, an upper limit on what kind of level of language ability they have. So for example, they will learn lots of vocabulary, but it's usually more concrete items rather than abstract concepts. They can string together a couple of words to make a sentence, but their sentences tend to be very simple. And that in general, their intelligence seems to be that of a small child. So let's say between 3 to 5 years old, and they're not able to get to the more abstract thinking beyond that. Another primate study looked at the effects of isolation. And the reason I want to bring this up is because so much of today's lesson is going to focus on social behaviors of primates and how they interact with others. Humans are also very social creatures. And so looking at how isolation affects primates can help us explain why humans behave certain ways due to isolation. So the Harlow monkey study is one that gave a lot of information, but was quite unethical for modern time period, which is that they would isolate these babies away from their mothers. And what we found was that when the primate was isolated as a baby, it developed a lot of really abnormal, aberrant behaviors. They would stare, they would pace, they would rock back and forth, they might even self-harm. And if you tried to introduce them later in life to a social group, they did not know how to behave and they would act either aggressively or fearfully. So a lot of the behaviors, the social behaviors that we associate with these primates are clearly learned behaviors. They learn it from their mother, they learn it from interacting with other members of their social group while they're still young. And if you take those opportunities for learning away from them, they're not able to learn those social skills later in life. The picture here, what it's showing is the importance of social and physical contact. So in this situation, what happened with this baby monkey is that it was provided with 2 fake surrogate mothers. The surrogate mother on the right was covered with cloth and was soft and fuzzy. It also has a more friendly monkey-like face, while the surrogate mother on the left was the one that had the milk bottle. So obviously the baby needs to drink milk to survive. However, what they found was that it would basically cling to the furry mom and snuggle with the furry mom all day long and only reach over to the other fake mom to drink the milk. So kind of a sad study. The other reason I want to bring this up is the idea that social isolation can cause severe psychological harm in humans as well. So in places like prisons, where social isolation is often used as a punishment, we hear from prisoners how awful it is and that they would try to avoid that. They would prefer almost any other situation, even being in the general population where they could potentially be physically assaulted or harmed by other individuals, they would still prefer that over being isolated. Another example would be how senior citizens decline in health when they're socially isolated. So as people get older, of course, all of us have declining health, but the people who tend to live the longest are those who are not just physically healthy, but who have a strong social support, whether it's family members, children, grandchildren who come to visit, neighbors, or other parts of their social activities that keep them engaged with other people. When people become isolated, they tend to have a decline in health as well as a lot of psychological problems as well. So why do primates live in groups? What's going on with that? If we look at other mammal species, there certainly are social species, but the vast majority of them are solitary, where it's the mother raising the offspring, and then the males and the females really only get together during mating season. However, when we look at primates, many of them live in groups, some of them in very large groups. So what's going on there? How is this helpful? Well, one thing is predator avoidance. If you live in the forest, you don't want someone sneaking up on you and eating you. So having a large group means there's more individuals that are vigilant, watching out for predators, and they can give alarms to warn each other. The other thing is that the larger groups are more successful at competing for territory and food. So if you have a small group of individuals and a larger group of individuals, and they're both fighting for the same resources, the larger group is probably going to win. It also makes it easier access to mates. If you are a socially isolated species, then you kind of have to wander around searching for a member of your own species, while if you are living together, much easier to find a mate. And you may have more successful reproduction if you have the help of other individuals, again, in obtaining those resources and protection. So what are some challenges with living in groups? There's something called the competition exclusion principle. What that means is that two species cannot live in the exact same niche because they would compete with each other over resources. What we saw with that is that evolution usually creates the evolution of separate species to occupy slightly different niches. We saw that with the Galapagos finches. They might live on the same island, but one of them lives up in the canopy eating insects, and one of them lives on the ground eating seeds. The same thing is true for primates. So even if they occupy the same forest, one of them might be eating a certain type of fruit, another one might be eating certain types of leaves, another one might be eating insects, and then they can all live in the same general area. That would be a sympatric situation where the two species occupy the same area. In an allopatric situation, they can eat the same resources, but they're going to live in different areas. For example, living in the jungle versus living in the savanna. And then complex social behaviors require that these animals have quite large brains and good memories. So the reason for that is because they're going to remember things like who helped them and who was mean to them, and they can hold grudges, and they can also be friendly to other individuals who help them. The other interesting thing about these social behaviors is to help reduce aggression, we're going to see the formation of dominance hierarchies. What that means is when you have a social group, some individuals have a higher rank than other individuals. And so this helps establish rules for who gets resources first, and it will decrease the chance of aggressive behaviors between the group members. So what are aggressive behaviors? Those are going to be behaviors such as fighting over the resources, mates, and this can result in injury or death. So that's very dangerous. And in general, you don't want to harm members of your own species because that's going to cause evolutionary decline. So we prefer affiliative behaviors. These are going to be things that promote social bonding, that cause the group to basically be nice to each other and to reduce aggression. We're going to see some more examples of this, but something like grooming is found across primates. Grooming, the idea of basically picking little particles out of the other individual's fur, whether that's insects or parasites, or just kind of like being pet. So it's a very pleasant feeling, and it's a way that members of a group will bond with each other. We also see altruistic behaviors. Those are behaviors that benefit another individual, but could come at a cost to yourself. So what does that mean? Think of, in humans, altruistic would be like running into a street and grabbing a child before it gets run over by a car. That's a very dangerous thing to do. You risk your own life to save them. Or it could be something like being generous and offering to buy a homeless person a meal. So you're using your own resources, your own money, to give them something nice without expecting anything in return. Altruistic behaviors in the wild are more likely to occur between related individuals. So usually small family groups, obviously the parents taking care of the babies, but also siblings and close cousins are more likely to show altruistic behaviors. And our explanation for this is something called kin selection. So the idea that if you help other individuals, members of your own family, they're more likely to survive, they're more likely to reproduce, and you share a lot of DNA with members of your family. So if you help them survive and reproduce, it's almost as good as having your own self survive and reproduce. Another interesting thing I wanted to point out was the case study of aggressive versus affiliative behaviors. So you might think that aggressive behaviors would be better in terms of getting what you want. You know, you shove the other guy away, you get the food. You shove the other guy away, you get the mate. However, what we see is that there's actually a lot of affiliative behaviors in primates as well. And one example was this troop of baboons where there were quite a few aggressive males originally. And what happened is, due to their own behavior, they ended up dying off. They contracted tuberculosis. And once they died off, the only males left in this troop were relatively submissive, kinder males. These ones were nice to the females and the babies of the group. They weren't fighting, they weren't harming anyone. And the tribe ended up really liking this new behavior to the point where they maintained it culturally over time. So as new baboons joined the troop, they were shown that this was the correct behavior. And if they tried to be aggressive or mean, they were chased away. And so they basically adopted this new affiliative behavior as well. Next, let's talk about primate communication. So we did talk a little bit about language studies, but that was trying to focus on teaching apes to communicate the way humans do. How do they communicate in the wild? They do use a little bit of smell. So olfactory, they might have some smells in the genital area or by spraying with urine, but that's not particularly common. That usually is more common in other types of mammals. In primates, remember that visual communication is going to be much more important. We do see the tactile communication. I mentioned grooming. So grooming is a very positive behavior that promotes social bonding in addition to hygiene, and it can create friendship and bonds between individuals who are not necessarily related, so that if you groom one individual, if you've heard the expression, I scratch your back and then you scratch my back. So if you do something nice for them, they might do something nice for you in the future. And it doesn't always have to be grooming. It might be that you groom them and then later they share some food with you. It also is seen that when males groom females, they may be more likely to be given the opportunity to mate with those females when the females are in their reproductive cycle. There are some types of vocal communication. We see things like screeches, howls, calls, depends on the species, but one of the main forms of communication is going to be to warn other members of your species. So an altruistic behavior of an alarm call, the reason it's altruistic is because it draws the attention of the predator to yourself. However, it might help save other members of your family. So we do see that in primates as well as some other mammals. Finally, for visual, there's definitely some examples of colors being used in primates to signal things like reproductive ability. In the bottom left picture, that's a mandrill, and you can see the blue and the red is a very distinct color on his face. He also has the same colors appear on his genitals. So that's going to be a signal to the female of his virility and health. We also see sexual swellings in females. So the picture in the middle is a female who is in her sexual cycle and she is reproductively available right now, which means she can get pregnant. And then this signals to the male that it is time. And at other times, she would not have that swelling. We do see some aggressive behaviors that use visual techniques. For example, if you've ever seen a typical movie with an ape that's really angry, they're screaming, they're shaking branches, they're throwing things at you. They might run up towards you in a very aggressive manner. And they have something called piloerection. That means all of the hair on their body is sticking up and fluffing up to make them look even bigger and scarier. So this is not unusual. We see this as a type of dominance display in gorillas and chimpanzees, for example, where instead of physically fighting, what the male will do is run around, like I said, screaming with his hair sticking up, looking really scary, and then the other individual will probably back down and run away. If the other individual does not back down, then the situation could escalate. But many times the dominance display is enough to demonstrate which of the two is the stronger one, and then this way we can avoid fighting. Facial expressions is something that is going to be more common in apes that have more control over their muscles than in, for example, some of these monkeys. But what's really interesting about it is I'm going to show you the chimpanzee. You remember the chimpanzee is very close to humans in terms of their DNA, and there's quite a few facial expressions they are able to do. So there's different expressions for playfulness. There's different expressions, of course, if they're screaming or angry, or if they're just being neutral. But one thing I thought was really neat is something called the fear grin. So in this picture, at first glance, you might think that the animal is smiling because they're pulling their lips back and they're showing the teeth. But in chimpanzees, this type of facial expression is actually one that shows that the animal is uncomfortable or afraid. It's not a happy look, which is neat because in humans, smiling is basically a universal signal for happiness. It almost doesn't matter what culture you come from. Even babies will smile naturally at their parents when the parents smile or laugh with them. So in humans, the smile has evolved to mean a happy emotion, while in our relative, the chimpanzee, it's actually a signal of fear. So just something to consider there. Next, let's look at food-seeking behaviors. So food-seeking behaviors kind of depend on what kind of food you're looking for. So for example, if you eat plants, okay, you're a folivore, there's leaves everywhere. So because there's leaves everywhere, you may not need to worry so much about sharing food. However, remember that the nutritional value is relatively low. So you might need a very large area that has enough leaves, and you need to kind of keep that area to your own group. In comparison, the frugivores are going to have only certain clumps where there's food because the fruit might only be ripe at certain times of the year. So again, you're going to have to try to protect that resource. And then finally, insectivores are kind of randomly distributed across depending on wherever they're going to find the insect. So now let's talk about the behaviors. Sharing food would definitely be an affiliative behavior. As I mentioned, it's something that might happen between members of the same family, but could also be a way to bond or to sort of promote kind of like a gift, right? So somebody groomed you and then now you have food, they're going to come over and ask you for some, they're your friend, okay, you give them some food. There are, of course, aggressive behaviors where you're protecting your territory against other members of a different species, but also possibly against other members of the same species. So you might patrol your area to make sure there's no intruders. You could also potentially steal food from somebody. Now, who would be likely to do that? This is going to depend on your dominance hierarchy. So because the higher ranking individuals get priority to food, it's possible that someone of a higher rank could come up to you and just take your food away, and you can't argue with them. You can't cry about it, because if you try to fight them, they're the bigger, stronger individual and you're going to lose. So we do see that sometimes in terms of them rank on you. Other interesting things with food seeking is the ability to use tools. So there's definitely evidence of primates using tools to acquire food. For example, chimpanzees do an activity called fishing for termites, where they take a stick and they peel off the bark of the stick to make it sticky. And then they put that into a termite hill. Termites, if you don't know what they are, they look like giant ants. And the termites are going to stick to that tool so that when the chimpanzee pulls them out, he can just lick off the termites. We also see monkeys as well as apes using rocks to crack nuts. And then some other types of behaviors, aggressive behaviors, would be hunting. Now, again, most of these animals eat plant matter, but chimpanzees definitely have been known to hunt other primates, potentially killing monkeys for food, and sometimes just killing other individuals because they're trying to protect their territory. Now let's look at reproductive strategies. So a lot of the reproductive strategy depends on whether you're male or female, and we see this in other mammals as well. All mammals do take care of their young, but it's almost always the female that does so. So the female is the one that put more energy into the gametes. Producing an egg is much harder than producing sperm. The males produce millions of sperm. The female produces, if you're a human, only one egg per menstrual cycle, but in other primates, maybe a couple, or other mammals, maybe a couple, but it takes a lot of energy to make that egg. After that, you have to undergo gestation while the fetus is growing inside of you. So that can take weeks or months. That's a lot of energy. And then once the baby's born, you have to feed it using your breast milk, and you have to take care of it and teach it how to survive in the world. So there's a lot of energy investment into that child. And with the females, they're going to be investing a lot of their life, sometimes years. If you're a chimpanzee, it can be almost 10 years before the juvenile is old enough to be considered a mature adult. So you're talking about years of investment. In comparison, most mammals, and even in primates, the males do not provide much parental care. There are some exceptions to this. So one interesting exception is the marmoset, where the male absolutely takes care of the baby and helps out with childcare. Now to something that's a little more negative. So because for males, their reproductive strategy is often to try to mate with as many females as they can, they may be in a situation where a new male joins a group and all the females of that group are either pregnant or they have a baby. And if they have a baby, they're investing their time and energy into that baby, and they are not ready to mate or to have a new baby at this time. So what might happen is something called infanticide. where the male will kill the existing babies of that group, because what happens is once the baby stops breastfeeding, the female will re-enter her reproductive cycle. And so now he can mate and she will be pregnant with his offspring. This behavior has been seen in multiple primates, where if a new male enters a group, he will kill the babies. Now, of course, the females might try to fight back. They're going to be very protective of their offspring, but it kind of depends on the situation. And we see this in other mammals as well. You may have heard of lions living in groups where there's one male lion and he's mating with several females. The same situation is if a new male lion takes over, he might kill the cubs of that pride. So what are some possible ways in which the males and females may interact in a social group? There's a couple different situations, and I'm going to go over the vocabulary. So monogamy, you may be familiar with, is the idea of one male mating with one female and sharing a long-term bonding situation. In this situation, they may both be providing childcare. In species that have monogamy, you often don't see that much difference between the males and females. So there's very little sexual dimorphism. Instead, we call it sexual monomorphism. They look very similar. And one example would be gibbons. In polyandry, you have one female who mates with multiple males. This is a relatively rare situation. And the example in this picture are the marmosets. So what they do, which is really unique, is that the female gives birth to twins. And it's very hard to take care of two babies at one time if you're a primate, because they are clinging to you. Okay, so you have to climb with this baby clinging to you. And you're also trying to provide them with food. So 2 is really kind of the maximum, right? Because they only have 2 nipples. If you look at other mammals that have litters, they usually have many nipples because they have so many babies. But in primates, usually 1 is more common. So the fact that marmosets have twins means that they need more parental care. And by mating with more than one male, she has more than one male helping her with taking care of the babies. So that's just a very unusual kind of situation. Then we have something called polygyny. In polygyny, it depends on whether you live in a social group or if you're solitary. So if you live in a social group, it means you have one male and his harem of females, which are all the females that he has access to for reproduction. And he protects that group, and he also makes sure that other males don't infiltrate the group. So example of that would be the gorilla, where you have the male gorilla and his females. Once their children start to grow up, if they are male, they will have to leave the group. Then you have polygyny in solitary examples like orangutans, where it's usually the mom and her child, and then the male is separate. But there is going to be male-male competition for those females. So it's possible that one male will have a territory, and any female in that territory he will mate with, and he's going to try to keep other males out, even though they don't live together in a social group. Then you have polygamy. So polygamy in primates is different than what you might be more familiar with in humans. In humans, when we think of polygamy, we think of the male with multiple wives. That's actually the polygyny, okay? And then the polygamy is a social group where you have multiple males and multiple females all living together, and they can all reproduce with each other. So there's many different possible mating pairs, and social hierarchy can come into play where maybe one male has more access to the females because he has a higher rank, but that doesn't mean that the lower ranked chimpanzee never has a chance. It just depends on if the female is available, if he can maybe get her kind of alone in a corner somewhere, and then there will still be mating happening. Okay, so let's review some of this. A polygynous group involves what type of male-female organization? So the correct answer is this is the organization of multiple females with one male. Name a primate species that has polygynous groups. So one example is the mountain gorilla. Name a primate species that has polyandry groups. So if you don't remember what polyandry is, that's the one where it's one female and multiple males. So one example of that are the marmosets. Now, what happens when the babies grow up? There is something called dispersal, and the idea of dispersal is that you leave your original family group. It depends on the species. In some species, the males will leave, in some species, the females will leave, but the benefits of this is to avoid inbreeding. Okay, so obviously if a gorilla is mating with the females, then the daughters are going to be his daughters. So, you don't want to have too much inbreeding going on there. But the other problem with this is going to be the cost. So you'd have to go find a new group. When you get to the new group, you might be the lowest primate, on the totem pole. So you're not going to have access to resources. You kind of have to work your way up. And you might also not know as much about the new range that you are living in, such as new predators or where the resources are, where the food is. And that wraps it up for chapter 6.